All right, I start recording.
All right. Thank you, Nita. Welcome, everybody. We are here with Dr. Chad Hoggan, and my role really is just to tell you a little bit about him, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hoggan to share information with us. And as you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat pod, and we can answer questions throughout, and then we'll also have some time at the end to answer questions. So a little bit about Dr. Hoggan. He has been at NC State since 2012 and is associate professor in the Educational Leadership, Policy, and Human Development Department. His research involves transformative learning, or those experiences that dramatically affect how people see themselves and the world around them. He has studied transformative learning with a wide range of research participants, ranging from post-secondary and graduate students to breast cancer survivors to military veterans. Based on this and other research, he developed a typology of transformative learning outcomes and other analytic tools to aid scholars in understanding and researching transformative learning. And Dr. Hoggan is joining us from Germany, so thank you for taking the time to be here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm thrilled to be here with you. My understanding of what we're going to do today is I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the research I've done, but I think instead of focusing on a particular study, I kind of wanted to talk a little more gestalt, a little more higher level, like what's kind of like the so what of what I've done in my mind. And yeah, a lot of my research has been around what's called transformative learning. And sometimes I hesitate to use that because it has such a very specific meaning, but I'm interested in how people change and adapt and how they're changed by dramatic experiences in life or non-dramatic experiences in life, but how they change in dramatic ways. And I think you'll see that in the kind of things I've looked at. So for instance, my dissertation was on breast cancer survivors because my family just has a long, dreadful history with cancer and of people dying way too young. But a couple of survivors in my family were my mother and my sister, who, when I was around 20 years old, they both got breast cancer within a few years of each other. And they both survived, but I noticed that their psychosocial effects from that disease were very, very different. I would say that my mother's was very negative, and my sister's was extremely positive. And so that just kind of spurred me, in this thinking of like, wow, so I mean, it's a truism that life events can affect us in different ways, but what does that mean really when somebody's faced with a life-threatening illness? And it's not just the fact that it's life-threatening. Breast cancer kind of affects a lot of things. The picture here, even of this young mother with no hair, for a lot of breast cancer patients, that's a big deal, losing your hair. I think in our culture, especially as a woman, losing your hair. And so anyway, so I looked at that, and I was interested in, for those women who do survive breast cancer and they consider it a positive experience, or is a very negative experience, but it had positive results in their lives. What did that look like? What did that learn, as a learning experience, kind of looking at it through that lens. And from then, it's funny. I couldn't bring myself to stay within this cancer survivorship thing. It's just kind of heavy for me. And so, I'm just always interested in this. So, I've looked at, what about people with their spiritual conversions or deconversions? Or what does it look like when you compare positive and negative transformations, right? So for many people, going to college can be a transformation, especially if they come from a non-college going background. And I think we would almost universally consider that a positive transformation. And then we have what I find very interesting, you have the military, which is very intentionally transformative. And it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily good or bad, but it's a very particular kind of transformation that's planned for and very deliberately done. And then you have transformations that kind of align a little bit with what we're talking about with this military boot camp kind of transformation and this kind of religious conversion transformation. You can see transformations where people become violent extremists. And this picture in the upper left, I think it's somewhat offensive, but I appreciate what it's getting at. And I don't think Muslims are the only group that can produce violent extremists. But so what does that look like? Does transformation always have to be positive, developmental and flowering out of our humanity, or can it be really negative and really limiting and really hateful? And so a lot of my research is not about finding either or answers to these, but just kind of understanding it. What do these kinds of things look at? So by the way, I've got tons of slides here, and my intention is not for most of them just to breeze right over. So for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, so the basis of it, at least in terms of a scholarly basis of it, this was based, a lot of this work is based on transformative learning theory, which was developed by Jack Mesereau, who is a sociologist by training. He was an adult education professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. Back in the 70s, he was doing this large evaluation grant where there's in community colleges across the country, women were enrolled in return to work programs. So the 1970s, of course, was a different era than it is now. But back then, it was kind of a big deal for women to return to work. I mean, they did in the 40s during World War II, of course, but that's because the country needed them to. And but in the 70s, there was, more and more women were saying, why do I have to be pigeonholed into very particular roles in society? What if I want a new career? And so community colleges were offering these programs for people who had been out of school in the workforce for a long time, wanted to get retrained so they could enter into it again. And of course, it has to be evaluated. Well, Mesereau, we're talking 12 community colleges in the Northeast and in the Northwest mainly, but across the US. And in doing the study, he said, yeah, these people are learning what they need to do to get a job, but there's something a lot more interesting going on here. And it was wonderful timing, because as a country, that was a big pivotal time for us in a lot of ways, especially in terms of gender equality. Not that we've fixed that problem, but it was a big movement. And so we had this big social movement going on, and he was looking at women who were right in the middle of it. And, he said basically, for a lot of reasons, these women were brought to question a lot of deep-seated assumptions about themselves and the world and their place in the world and the proper role of women and what they're actually capable of or not, and blah, blah, blah. And since then, adult education just grabbed onto this theory and have just kind of run with it in a lot of different ways. And increasingly, people outside of adult education have grabbed onto it. And people in a lot of other disciplines, because everybody's concerned about education in some way or another, I swear. And so this theory is just hugely popular. But those were the origins of it. So in a nutshell, I think what some of the conceptual tools that Mesereau provided for us, because his theory is what it is. It's pretty good. It has some weaknesses. It's applicable in some areas more than others. But he gave us some tools so that we can talk about things. So for instance, he framed his work in social constructivism, basically saying that, how a person experiences the world is constructed in their head, right? I mean, you can talk about outside events that happen, but we all take those events and we put them through our own filters and we make sense of them. And so he gave us some, and he called that our frames of reference. And over time, he changed, he talked about meaning perspectives, like what perspective do we bring to something to make meaning out of it. And then over time, he talked about the same thing in terms of having habits of mind and points of view. So a point of view is just your opinion on something. But a habit of mind is like, what are these things that we do that operate behind the scenes? The things that we bring to the world. So what was a famous example he gave? Specific views we have on immigration or on what policy should be or whatever, he would call points of view, but a habit of mind would just be xenophobia, right? Or tribalism. Like what's best for me and my people is more important than what's best for other people who are outside of my social group. That's the deeply embedded habit of mind. And so Mezirow would say, it's important to challenge our points of view and to look at evidence and to talk with people. But those are relatively easy changes to make. What's hard to do is to become aware of those habits of mind, like, let's say, xenophobia or tribalism, and to really engage with that. And when you change those things that are so common sense that we don't even realize they're there, that's when people really transform. So in these terms, he came up with types of learning just so we can talk about it, right? He said whenever we learn, we develop new points of view. We might revise certain points of view. We might transform a point of view, but none of that's really transformative as a person. But when we transform a habit of mind, that's really transformation. And the way he thought that you went about it was to develop a sense of solidarity with people that see the world differently and engage in critical discourse where you talk to each other. And instead of not a debate, but you try to help each other understand where you're coming from. And you both try to collect evidence and say, how valid is my view? And the focus in these conversations with others is always internal. It's not trying to convince somebody you're right, but trying to benefit from their perspectives and question how yours could be better. And when he says better, he means it's more discerning. It's instead of just accepting what we were taught as children, that it actually kind of says, no, I've thought about this and I've applied some criteria to it, and this is what I really think. But it's more discerning, more integrative of experience. It can explain a wider variety of experiences. It's more permeable, right? So it's more open to data, to being wrong, more inclusive. And yeah, so I mean, his theories, it's great. These are some of the high points of it, but you'll see these conceptual tools being used in a lot of different studies when people are trying to describe how people learn and change in dramatic ways. So by way of kind of a history of the theory, though, so Mezirow said all this stuff. He wrote a book, and he published his first work in like 1978. During the 80s, people are kind of quiet about it. 89-ish, there's a couple critiques of his work that are published, and then so he responded to them. Now these conversations going on in the literature. 1991, he published a book, and from then on, it's the most researched theory in adult education. And one thing that Mezirow did that I thought was cool was he never tried to proselytize his theory, right? He didn't care. He was always very adamant. He's like, this is the way I see the world. This is how I think people change. But if you think it's different, bring it. Like, come on. I mean, help me understand, because I realize that I only have one perspective. And I think that's really cool. And if you see that in his book, the 2000 edited book, Learning is Transformation, that's all he's doing is he's inviting other well-known scholars into the conversation where they can find points of commonalities and find points of difference. So one of these approaches is what's called the psychoanalytic approach. So this is where it was started by his mentor, but John Dirks is the main name behind this now. But he basically said, yeah, people transform. And and he's like, and I can use the language of frames of reference and meaning perspectives. I mean, that all makes sense to me. But what I don't agree with, and this is not me, this is John Dirks, is that it's primarily driven by some kind of rational process of talking to other people and unearthing assumptions. And it sounds too rational, too cognitive. People, we all have rational abilities, but we're not rational creatures. We're very emotional creatures. So he draws his influences from Jung's work. So Carl Jung, who was a contemporary of Freud, they were friends, then they were opponents, and blah, blah, blah. So Jung has this theory about, the psyche and different parts and stuff like that. But in terms of transformation, what this means is that transformation is brought about by paying attention to your inner world, to your emotions, to your fantasies, to your dreams. And by paying attention to it and not fighting against these things, but really opening yourself up to them. It's not a rational process. It's an opening up to who you really are. Makes you more integrated as a person, makes you a more whole person, makes you more self-aware, makes you more authentic. And this is very transformative. I'm going to offer just one more. There's lots of them, but just one more. So then we have Bob Kegan, who I think he's retired now, but he was at Harvard for many years, extremely famous. And he's kind of followed the tradition of Piaget and other developmental theorists. What Keegan's big contribution is all these other theorists looked at human development throughout childhood. But he said, no, he's like, here's a way of looking at development, and this extends potentially all through life. And his big thing was that development, he called it epistemology, a way of knowing. I would call it a change in ontology, but whatever. But he basically said, we see the world through our own lenses, of course, and he was able to graft his work onto Mesros fairly easily using that language. But he said, but the real key in development is when we're able to separate what we think is us and then realize that's not really us. So to give you some examples, if you ever know the terrible twos and threes are even worse, right? And kids just throw a fit at every little thing. Keegan explained that as, that's because a child at that age, it's not that they have wants and desires, it's that their wants and desires are completely enmeshed in their sense of identity, who they are. So when they don't get what they want, it's not just disappointment like you and I experience it, it's intensely threatening because what they want is who they are. And it's only when they advance past it and they're separate, then they can have wants and desires. Until then, wants and desires have them. And he would say the same thing about teenagers, where we go through this stage of development where relationships define who we are. And if you look at it through that lens, that really explains a lot, right? Like what's the stereotypical teenager or whatever. And he said, when you're at the developmental stage that your relationships define who you are at a deep, deep level, you can't really have relationships. Relationships have you. And development is the process of separating yourself from that and recognizing that these are things that I have. I have relationships, but they're not me. I'm separate from that. So that's that descriptor, this subject-object differentiation is I think really cool. And it's what he described as what development looks like throughout the lifespan. And he would say, not everybody ever grows out of what we're calling these teenage years. Some people never do. And even people that do, then there are further stages that become possible. But, I think he has 5 total, but even the 5th, very few people actually accomplish. But his point was, when people go through these developmental stages, that's transformative because they see the world differently. They are different people. They understand things differently. They think differently. They decide differently. They act differently. Everything. It is completely transformational. And he would say too, it's not like Mesereau saying you're questioning assumptions. And he certainly wouldn't say it's paying attention to your inner fantasies. He would say it's an interaction with the world where you have environments that are challenging, that challenge the way that you're currently experiencing the world, but also provide support so that you feel validated in how you're doing it. So you're not investing this emotional cognitive energy in defending how you're seeing the world. That if you feel that you're supported, that you're accepted, you can just kind of let that go. And then as you respond to challenges, you can experience this kind of development. So I'm a big fan of all these things. Mesereau, Dirks, Keegan, these are brilliant people and they did fantastic work that's really, really helpful. But my point is this. At first, we had transformational learning as a phenomenon that Mesereau defined very specifically as, whatever, he defined it very specifically. And then we have other people that came in and talked about transformation. But if you look at what Mesereau said, what Dirk said, what Keegan said, they're talking about very different phenomena, very different ways that people change. But they used the same term, transformational learning. And it was more than that. I mean, this is a cheap little graphic, but Ed Taylor came up with 8 different main streams of thought about how people were talking about transformation and how it happens in all this, where I've just talked about 3, but there's more. So what we have then is, in my mind, we have a phenomenon that adults are capable of changing in dramatic ways. And the truth of it, in my mind, is they're capable of changing in a lot of different ways, right? They can have a religious conversion and become the next saint, or they can become a violent extremist and blow people up, right? I mean, so many things are possible. And it's okay if people use one word to encompass all that, but I think this has to be defined pretty carefully if that's what you're going to do. All right, I need to take a quick pause to talk about this slide because I need to be able to talk about it later without introducing it later. So, when people talk about transformative learning, especially let's say transformative education, and I read about this all the time. I'm a co-editor at the Journal of Transformative Education. So I get manuscripts all the time where educators, scholars are saying, here's a program that I developed. And it's interesting to read it because sometimes they're not, well, they say things that I think they should reflect on. But in essence, what they say is, hey, here's a way that I think other people need to change dramatically. And I designed an educational program to change other people dramatically. And this is what I did. I'm always like, oh, that just reeks of indoctrination, of manipulation, of that just, and noticing that caused me to think about, what are different ways we could approach transformative education. And with my colleague and collaborator, Tanya Klubert, we came up with these like 3 orientations. Now, one way to look at it is to say that there's an orientation that's outcome focused, that's focused on just the dimensions or characteristics, the transformative dimensions of learning within any learning experience. And there's another orientation that looks at the context or situation and what aspects of it might inherently be transformative. Another way of saying the same thing that I think might be easier for most people to, when they're first hearing about it, to make sense of it, is one is a prescriptive approach. So a prescriptive approach is, hey, I'm the educator. I know how you need to change. I see your faults. I see your limitations. Here's how you need to change in dramatic ways that are going to affect your relationships, reflect your moment-to-moment lived experience. This is how I'm going to do it. And I hope you can tell by the way I'm describing it that I'm very disdainful of that approach. I think you would have to have amazing justification to be able to make that claim that you have the right to try to change people in dramatic ways. Not that you never do, right? If somebody wants to commit murder, I think you might be able to justify trying to change him or her from that way of thinking. But in most cases, I think that's a little bit problematic. Then there's process-oriented approaches to transformative learning. And this is where I think Mesereau, where I would put him, where he was saying, if I were Mesereau, I would say, I really think that if we got people who saw the world differently to come together in a spirit of solidarity to talk about their commonalities and their differences and to really critically self-reflect on the assumptions they're making about the world, that process will bring them to better views. And by better, I just mean more expansive. Mesereau never said transformative learning leads to a certain way of seeing the world. Never. He said it hopefully leads to just better ways of seeing the world, more expansive, more discerning, all that kind of stuff. And then a third approach I would call adaptive. And this is the one I don't think I would have ever thought about it this way until in the process of writing my most recent book. The book was looking at community college students from backgrounds of poverty, from first generation, people for whom higher education feels like a foreign environment. And it occurred to me that, that whole experience is by nature holds the potential for transformation. If nothing else, it's going to challenge people in ways that could lead to transformative learning. And so taking care to design those learning situations so that they support people, so that those transformations they experience are positive for them rather than negative, or rather than just leaving them frustrated and they don't resolve their dilemmas. It's the adaptive approach is recognizing when the situation is inherently challenging in a way that can be transformative and then supporting it. In my mind, having those distinctions is so critically important. All right. So I'm going to skip over slides. Basically, several years ago, I was looking at this thing where Mesereau, Dirks, Keegan, and others were calling everything under the sun transformative learning. And I thought we needed some greater analytic tools to be able to put fences around what transformative learning was, and then to be able to talk about it with more clarity. So this is an incredibly tedious process. If you ever want to know about it, we can do another session or let me know. But basically, we pulled all these articles, all these research studies on transformative learning, analyzed them in terms of how they were defining what transformation is. We came up with 213 articles, over 1,000 coded excerpts. From them, we generated 28 codes, which we further condensed down to 6 broad categories. And if that doesn't sound tedious to you, I don't know what will. It was awful. I don't really desire to do it again. But basically what we said is 2 things. One, if we're going to define what's transformative learning, we can't be so specific like Mesereau was. I mean, Mesereau said transformative learning is, and he said it's this one thing. And other people are also saying it's this one thing. Dirk saying, like, right, it's becoming more authentic. We're like, well, that's a bad definition, because that doesn't encompass enough things that could legitimately be called transformation. So I came up with the definition of it. It has to, transformative learning is, or refers to experiences that dramatically change how a person experiences, conceptualizes, and interacts with the world. So the way they experience it, like on a moment-to-moment basis, how does it land on them? What's their emotional reaction? How do they make sense of things? How they conceptualize it is more about how do they conceptualize things? How do they think about it? What are the narratives that they use to explain the world or their life or whatever, and how they interact with the world. Like, how does it change their behavior? And I kind of think that anything worthy of being called transformation would have to do those 3 things, right? If it doesn't change how you experience the world, how you conceptualize the world, and how you interact with the world, I don't understand how somebody could say that's transformation. That doesn't mean that if it does those 3 things, it's necessarily transformation, because to me, transformation implies something big, something profound. So in my mind, if it's going to be transformation, then it has to have depth, breadth, and relative stability. Depth means it's got to be a big impact. It can't change somebody in a minor way and say that was transformation. That just doesn't fly, right? So it's a big impact for depth. Breadth is it has to affect more than just one context in their life. Like if somebody says that, yeah, I went to graduate school and I was in this class and it taught me feminist theory, and when I'm in class, I can talk in those terms and think in those terms, but when I go home, I don't. Like, that's cool, but that's not transformation. It would, when you change, it would have to affect how you are at work, how you are at home, how you are when talking with the neighbor, how you are at church. Every context you're in, you would think would be affected by it. And then relative stability was a term that I finally used, and I used to say it was permanent, but I didn't mean permanent, because you can change again, right? Or even under times of duress, or when contextual triggers hit you, you can actually revert back to previous ways of thinking and feeling, but temporarily. I think it's going to be transformation that for the most part, you don't really ever go back to where you were. And then from that study, we developed a typology, basically saying, if we're going to talk about how people change in dramatic ways, then we should consider what are the ways that it affects their sense of self, it affects their worldview, it affects their epistemology, which is their way of knowing, it affects their ontology, which is their way of being, how it affects their behavior, and how it affects their overall capacity. This is more kind of like cognitive development. Like a 5-year-old can't do calculus, not because she doesn't have the prerequisite math courses, because a 5-year-old brain can't do calculus. Or in my case, a 49-year-old brain can't do calculus. Either way. So for each of those general categories, there's an infinite possibility for subcategories, right? So I'm not saying if somebody changes and we say, well, how does it change your sense of self? I mean, like, yeah, but I mean, it could change your sense of self in a lot of different ways. It could, from the studies that we pulled, we generated what, 7 subcategories of self that you can read for yourself here. Same thing with all of them. Okay, I want to talk about that. So let's do this. So their sense of self could be how I change in terms of my relationship to others or to the world, how I feel connected or not from nature, from other people, from all of life, whatever it is. Or people talk about gaining a sense of empowerment, or changes their view of themselves or their self-knowledge. It could change the personal narrative they have, the stories that's running in their mind that they use to make sense of their life and of their experience of whatever. Finding or changing the meaning and purpose of life, or if you're Jungian, a change in your personality. So I did some work a while back with the National Security Agency, where we were developing these analytic tools to try to be able to have better ways to talk about violent extremists. And so one way I did that was I said, well, here's a stereotypical way that higher education is designed to transform people in positive ways. And not necessarily in a prescriptive way, but in a way that just in general terms, if people are going to change, we hope it's like this. And this is what it might look, this is what, from what I can tell in the research literature, it looks like when people become radicalized. And so I was trying to compare those. And we don't have the time for me to walk through each of the 6 categories in the typology, but let's spend some time on one or maybe 2, just so you can get a sense for what I'm talking about. So we talk about change in the sense of self. A lot of times for students, especially if they come from a non-college going tradition, when they graduate college especially, so when they're in college, they wrestle with this issue of self. Do I belong here? Am I legitimately a college student? They have this imposter syndrome going on a lot of times. And when they finally graduate, one of the big clicks, if you will, is this, I did it. I'm a college graduate. And I'm telling you, those of you working on your, I don't know if it's so true with your master's, but I think certainly those of you working on your doctorate, that's the big change. People get their doctorate and then for a while they're like, I'm a doctorate. When I first got my doctorate, I suffered imposter syndrome, something fierce. Of course, I got a doctorate and I became a professor at the same time. And that was horrible because the whole time I'm like, people are going to figure this out. They're going to know that I'm just faking it. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I don't know nearly as much as they think I know. And when you finally kind of work through that and get on the other side, that's in some ways transformational. It's a change in your identity, how you view yourself. And being a college graduate in the United States is kind of pivotal, especially if you come from a background where nobody's a college graduate. That's kind of a big shift. But when we talk about people becoming radicalized, the change in the sense of self looks different. So 3 ways that we named. One is a change in self in relation to others. A lot of times I think this is, for me, is a very negative thing. I hate tribalism. But a lot of times in radicalization, there's an intentional us versus them, right? We are the chosen group. We're the ones that know the truth. We're the ones who've been wronged. We're the ones that have been called upon to right this wrong. And instead of a feeling of being connected with all of humanity or all of life or whatever, there's much more of a feeling very strongly connected with one's tribe and an alienation from the other. And there's a purposeful othering because you have to be willing to kill the other. Empowerment and responsibility is another area. So imagine growing up in a situation that for whatever reason you feel, let's say you grew up in Kabul, and you feel there's a world power that is well, way too powerful and it's destroyed your country and is led by evil people who follow the wrong religion, blah, blah, blah. But there's nothing you can do about it. How do you fight back against the world's greatest power? But then some people come to you and they're like, oh, but you can. There is a way you can affect change. And in this sense of empowerment, like, oh, I can do something about it. I can affect change. It's hugely transformative, especially when you really buy into it. And usually whenever there's a sense of empowerment, there comes with it a sense of responsibility, the Spider-Man thing. And then also a lot of times there's a change in personal narrative, right? Like I understood the world a certain way, these different storylines in my head, and somebody comes and offers you a different narrative. They're like, oh no, the story you're telling yourself isn't true. This is a story that's much more helpful. And you're like, oh, that's right. So my point here is, if you're going to analyze how people are making sense of the world, and you could then say, how do they change in the way they're making sense of the world, which is learning? This is a tool to try to help guide you through the process. The first step is saying, for instance, How did it change their sense of self? But then you need to go deeper and you just say, well, did it change and just ask yourself, like, in these, I mean, here are 6. Did it change their sense of relation? Did it change their sense of empowerment, their sense of identity? But there could be more, right? That's just 6 that we have right now. And then the step after that would be to add even more detail, more nuance to how is this meaning-making system work? How do they think? All right. So we don't have time for all this, but worldview is the same. There's subcategories, and then we can use those same subcategories to talk about what it would look like for higher education, what would it look like for radicalization. Same with epistemology, ontology, behavior. Behavior is kind of funny. So behavior, I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. If somebody said they transformed but it didn't change their behavior, I would say they didn't change. If you think you've learned to change, it didn't change how you behave, then I disagree with you. But if somebody said that they changed but they only changed their behavior, then I also would say that doesn't sound big enough. So behavior always has to be there, but it's never enough in and of itself. And then capacity. And this is kind of a big category, because we're using it because we didn't want tons of extra little appendages. But in some cases, we use it to refer, when people talk about cognitive development, they develop the capacity for critical thinking. They develop the capacity for metacognitive thinking about their thinking. But a lot of people also talk about consciousness. And the way they talk about it is in developing the ability to feel their connection with a wider sphere of life other than just the unitary self. And same when people talk about spirituality, they usually, in the literature that we looked at, they were talking about it in terms of feeling connected to something larger than yourself. In which case, when we look about that with radicalization, absolutely spirituality, where people feel connected to something, not just their own life, but to a greater cause. So Alyssa asked, so is transformative whatever in a way a constant flux of imposter syndrome? I don't know. I wouldn't say that, imposter syndrome has to be involved in every transformative experience. But I think that when we talk about things such as college graduation, or sometimes getting a new job, or being immersed in a new role, I mean, becoming a parent. Being a parent, that's imposter syndrome. That's like, my first daughter, I'm like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing with this. I hope she don't die, because I'm just trying to figure this out. And then, they get older, they're teenage years, and you want to hug them and you want to throttle them and throw them against a wall, right? You're like, how do I deal with this? There's no right answer here. And a lot of it, I think there was imposter syndrome going on. Like, I don't know how to be a parent, but I think everybody deals with that. So I think a lot of times when we go through big experiences like that, I think imposter syndrome shows up a lot. I don't think it's the one thing that answers everything, but I think it is there. All right. So this is what would look like, for instance, as we went through all those slides about higher education, then what I would do is I would say, well, when we look at those 6 categories, underneath them, we have these subcategories. So we have, what is that? 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9 things. So we have 9 ways specifically. So it allows you, it gives you the conceptual tools to say, let me describe what the transformative experience from higher education looks like. And I've got 9 paragraphs or pages or chapters to write based on that. So again, the purpose of the typology we developed was really where I was trying to say is, like, people, if you want to talk about profound learning and change, it doesn't have to be transformative, even minor learning. If it doesn't have depth, breadth, and relative stability, but you want to talk about how somebody learns and changes, this is still a useful way. My thing was like, just have some clarity about it. Don't call everything transformative learning, or do, I don't care, but bring with it some detail and some nuance, because they don't, just because people change in dramatic ways doesn't mean that change is always the same. And this is what it would look like for radicalization. And that might be it. That is it. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Dan, I have a question about how to make TL happen in a classroom. I swear, Dan, if you mean like in a prescriptive way, I'm gonna mute you for the rest of the class. So I'm happy to address that in a couple of ways, but maybe you could give me a follow up to that question.
Yes, and yeah, so I was familiar with your 2016 work, and I incorporated that into a paper for my capstone, and so I tried to narrow it and think about, could transformational learning occur in an economics classroom? And looking at your 24 types, 6 categories, I identified seven types of transformational learning in 5 categories that I thought could fit well within a conversation that can happen in a macro or a microeconomics class. And so then the question, and I promise it's not prescriptive, it was around posing questions and getting students to revisit their points of view, with the idea that if you stacked up enough points of view that became modified, then you start to put pressure on the habit of mind. Is that a model, so taking it beyond economics, is that a model that we could think about in terms of, if you feel that you have a topic, and I don't know, could English literature, maybe, a grammar class, composition, I don't know if transformational learning could happen there, but economics touches many different areas. And so there was a possibility, not 24 possibilities like in your typology, but I think maybe 7 at least to get started. Is that a way for us to think about how to take this research and potentially bring it into a classroom to create an opportunity to prompt transformational learning? Is that how you would see that research being applied, or one way to apply it?
Yes. One important caveat, I would say absolutely. So there's a book out called Transformational Learning and Threshold Concepts, or Threshold Concepts and Transformational Learning, or something like that. Threshold Concepts is really cool. And it's basically saying, like, every discipline, every subdiscipline has certain thresholds, has let's say certain doorways through which students really struggle to go through. And until they do, they never really get it. It doesn't click. They don't really understand what it means to think and be in this discipline, right? Economics is hard. Economics is such a difficult thing to learn. And I think that's because they have a few threshold concepts, but it's not a concept. It's not just a concept. It could be a way of thinking. I think that even though I say I don't want to be prescriptive, I think also, if you're in higher education, for example, and you're saying I'm going to teach, my job is to teach this class how to think like an economist. My job is to help you cross some of those thresholds, right? And those could be transformational. In some ways, I do need you to transform into being an economist, into being whatever you would call somebody who's studying English literature or whatever, right? The only caveat I would throw is, when we talk about depth, breadth, and relative stability, I would think you need depth and you need relative stability, right? You have to have that switch. But I don't think it necessarily has to have the breadth. I don't need you to think like an economist when you're talking with your neighbor, if that makes sense. Now, whether you do or not, it's a different story. Do some people adopt the role of whatever their discipline is, and does it infuse everything? Yeah, sure. But as the instructor, I don't care about that. Whether it happens or not, then I don't care. It's not what I'm trying for. But what I am trying to get is depth and relative stability. I'll give you an example for that, and then I'll go to some of these other questions. So in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is one of my favorite, I hate self-help books, man. I hate them, but I love that book. That is a fantastic, fantastic book. And but there's one part in there, there's truth in it. There's a helpful metaphor, but I also I have some problems with it. But basically, he was talking about relationships. And he said, in every relationship, it's like you have an emotional bank account. And whenever you do things, you keep a promise, you do what you say you're going to do, whatever, you're putting a deposit into that bank account. And every time you screw up, you take a withdrawal from it. And I'm like, yeah, there's some value to be held there. But the thing is that if you're in a one-sided relationship where somebody's always taking, never giving, I got it. But man, that is not a good way to be in a relationship. So for all of us in a relationship, my advice to all of us is don't keep score that closely. I think there are perceptions of deposits and perceptions of withdrawals that are different between partners. But I noticed it seemed to me that as great a person as Stephen Covey was, and I'm a huge fan. I think he was a good person. He had an accountant's way of thinking that he used to think about a non-accounting thing. And so when he learned that way of thinking, I think it was transformative. And he was showing me breadth by thinking like an accountant in a non-accounting context. And that's where I'm like, yeah, it's for me. That's that thinking of that story is helpful for me to think about in thinking about that difference between depth, breadth, and relative stability, and what the role in the classroom should be, which is depth and stability, but not breadth. So,
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. All right, Chris, you discussed behavior as being necessary but not sufficient. What would be sufficient on their own? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think first off, if somebody had a change to their sense of self, a change to their sense of identity, that's going to be transformative. I tend to think that any transformations, it has to affect people in more than one way. So Ilderis especially, but a lot of people I think would say that if it's going to be transformational, it has to affect, I say it has to affect behavior. Other people say it has to affect identity, but I don't disagree. I think any transformation would have to affect both of those things. Does it have to affect your epistemology? Does it have to affect it? I don't know. I would struggle to think that somebody experienced a big transformation, but it was only in one subcategory. I think there's just more parts that tend to be there. But I wouldn't say that the transformation would have to pull in all 6 of those categories. I'm not that dogmatic about the categories. Nita, using TL lenses, what is your prediction of adult education trend in the next 5 or 10 years after this pandemic? Oh, I don't know. Because TL has been such a huge, the most popular theory for 25, 35 years. I think there's going to be a tendency for people to want other lenses. I think you kind of get burned out of it, right? As a field. So in terms of popularity theory, I don't know, but it's going to be around. Now, how might adult education use TL theory after the pandemic? It could be. I think 2020, for a lot of reasons, is probably going to go down in my memory similar to 2001, September 2001, right? The world shifted after 9/11. There was a sense of security that it was tacit. I never realized I had it as an American that went away after September 11th. And we see a lot of negative consequences from it. Before September 11th, you didn't see American flags flying on every house down the neighborhood. That nationalism that grew up, and I don't think there's anything wrong with flying a flag, but when you see everybody do it, imagine being in Germany and seeing everybody flying the German flag. How creepy that would be. Imagine being in Russia and seeing everybody fly the Russian flag. You would think, oh, look what the indoctrination going here. But in America, ever since 9/11, that's been a thing, right? So I think it's kind of a watershed moment. And I think the pandemic with the George Floyd and BLM protests, with the questioning of America as a functioning democracy, like the whole question is like, if Trump loses the election, would he actually step down? We've never wrestled with that before. We've wrestled with things like BLM before, but it's come at a time. And since 1915, we haven't dealt with a pandemic in America. So we have a lot of big things happen that's, I think, shaking the U.S. and how we see things. And I think there's going to be a lot of ways that we collectively are changing right now.
Can I have one more question?
Sure.
Sorry, related to that. So what is the relationship between epistemology and ontology?
Fair. So first off, I borrow those very common terms in philosophy. Matter of fact, one branch of philosophy is epistemology, and a less popular one is ontology. But I'd probably be the first to say that the way I use it is not quite pure. I think philosophers might disagree with how I use it. But when I talk about epistemology, that's the science of knowledge. What can be known? How is it known? Things like that. So I use it in terms of, on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis, how do I justify, in my own mind or in my dialogues with others, how do I justify what I believe? Where do I go? So people in professions, when they study specific disciplines, most disciplines have an epistemology. This is how you justify your knowledge claims. I think all of us have things that we do on a moment-to-moment basis. For instance, some people, they go with their gut, right? On a moment-to-moment basis, they're just like, I make decisions based on how it lands on me. And I can argue for and against that. But when I talk about epistemology, I'm talking about learning ways of deciding what it is you believe. So those can be very formal things, critical thinking, scientific method. It can be things like that. A lot of times we'll see people develop, let's say, for instance, learning to listen to their intuition, listen to their gut, listen to their body. I hear people talk about artistic ways of knowing. Like when I engage in art, it's a way of knowing the world that's just different. And I think, to the extent that those different ways of knowing are used by a person in their life, that's what I mean by epistemology. By ontology, that's the science, the study of being. So in pure terms, there's like, is there a God? Like, what's ultimate being? And of course, the problem they have is, I don't know, what's your epistemology? How do I know what I know? What I mean by that is how a person exists. So that means things such as my dispositions and my tendencies. So when I walk down the street and I see something happen, what's my emotional reaction to it? When something bad happens, what's my reaction? Do I get frustrated? How do I respond to the frustration? Like, what's my lived experience? How do I exist in the world? So if somebody's habitually pessimistic, and then for whatever reason, they learn and develop the habit of being less pessimistic, more optimistic, then that would be a change in ontology. If I went through the world in a gray funk because of depression, and then through therapy and drug treatments and whatever, that funk lifted, that would be a change in how I experience the world on a moment-to-moment basis. That would be an ontological change, as per my definition of ontology. I'm always worried some philosopher is going to hear me talk and be like, shut me down, like, Chad, you got to be quiet. You're using that term incorrectly. Let's see, Miranda, I'm interested in workforce development. Do you see a relationship between the two? A relationship between what? Workforce development and community economic development? Absolutely. Between transformational learning and those things. I think so. I think whenever, like Einstein's famous quip that, the problems of today will never be solved with the same level of thinking that caused the problems. I think that's very true. And I think that points to the role of transformative learning. I think a lot of the problems that we have in our personal life, that we have in our relationships, that we have in society, the problems are caused because of the way that we're thinking about them, by the premises we use, the assumptions we make, the values we hold. And a lot of times we have to change that, and then the problem just kind of goes away. It's not like it gives you the tool to solve the problem ceases to exist. And so I think when we're talking about economic development and things like that, it's kind of the same thing. It's how do we as society think about things that are relevant. Alyssa, the transformative learning method you dislike, here's how you change. Isn't that where standardized testing is trying to do it? Is set a mark for students to reach the pass. So the question is standardized testing indicative of trying to change people? Maybe, maybe not. Again, I'm not saying that education shouldn't push towards a certain end, because I don't think it can do anything except push towards a certain end, right? I mean, kind of like Frere's notion that he copied from others, that no education is neutral. Education either supports the status quo or it challenges the status quo, but it does something. You can't not do something.
Mm.
Standardized testing is trying to say the things that we want you to learn, we want to be consistent in Alabama and in California and in wherever.
Mm-hmm.
My problem with standardized testing isn't, I don't think there's as much value on the standardization as others seem to think. I think it's okay if people became experts, if you will, in different things. That's like saying all of us adults should all be, a certain level of knowledgeable about everything out there, from geology to biology to English literature to everything else. Like, no, of course not. And so I'm not sure it's necessary for us to have that level of standardization in kids. My bigger problem with it is the form of standardized testing, of taking multiple choice questions.
Mm-hmm.
I question that as a way of assessing knowledge to begin with, much less, some kind of standardization of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it is 12:57, so we've got probably a minute and a half, 2 minutes. If there's one more question, I think we probably have time for it. All right, so in absence of a question, I'll just leave maybe a
I
pause.
have one last question. So what do you think are the obstacles for transformational changes in higher education?
You mean within higher ed, as opposed to institutional inertia is my first thought. I think that's the biggest challenge to change in any social system, is the way things have always been. Because the way things are, the systems in place are shaped by, but they also shape our ways of thinking about things. I think too, we don't have a crystal clear image of what higher education should look like. If we're saying it should change, well, change towards what? We're not really clear on that. And a lot of these things they're really, tricky once you get down to brass tacks, right? Like, it's hard to answer, like, what should higher education do? What does learning mean? How should we get, what should be the knowledge or the capacities or the whatever that result from college or whatever. And until we can really articulate that, it's hard to know how we should change. Higher education, it's an evolution. It used to be, way back in the day, for what? Landowners, nobility, where they sent their sons and only their sons. It was highly influenced, of course, by the Jesuits who ran schools, and they taught people Latin and Greek, and they read the Bible and the Iliad and stuff like that. I mean, it was preparing people to be cultured. And now we're like, well, no, it needs to prepare people to prepare them for a particular job. And it's like, well, we don't want it to be about a particular job. It needs to prepare people to live well and to know how to live a good life. But it also needs to teach people how to live well in pluralist society. There needs to be a civic component to it. Like, there's all these things that we want it to be, and we don't really know. We don't have an agreement on what specifically it should lead to. So therefore, we don't know exactly how to change it.
So I kind of feel like the future skills that higher education should prepare for the students, so that when they graduate, they are ready to enter the workforce or pursuing another path. So, like, I think this is something that they probably should start changing. I don't know.
Maybe. So there's some very famous surveys of CEOs of major companies. What is it that your employees, you need your employees to do? What skills and capacities? And those things are almost exclusively soft skills, right? Leadership capabilities. But then when you look at what do people need, because if that's what we develop people with, then the universal complaint is your graduates are not ready to enter the workforce. We hire them, and yeah, great, they know leadership stuff. They're creative. They have soft skills, but they can't do this job. Well, okay, so do we prepare people, even if we say that higher education should be about employment, and I don't think it is, but if it is all about employment, is it to enter the workforce, or to develop the capacity so that later on in the career, they're more effective. And yeah, again, I don't think we have a clean answer to that. One, I don't think it's just about workforce stuff. Higher education was never meant to be that. And I'm not convinced that's the only consideration. But I will admit, people do need to be able to contribute so they can get a job and actually do the job.
Especially like after this pandemic, like everything is very uncertain and the old rule doesn't really apply or might not be useful anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think that yes, and I think it always will be. All right, with that, we're over time, so I'll let you all go and get back to your productive day or whatever. And
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoggan, for
Thank you, Dr.
this
Hoggan.
wonderful presentation and helping us to understand more about transformative education. And for you all who have any questions, please feel free to drop it here so I will send it to Dr. Hoggan. Maybe he can help address that later. Thank you, Chad. Bye.